Enough historical fluff, stop chewing on historical cliches. You're being sold great victories while total incompetence and rot are hidden behind the pathos. Want to know how the elite of 18th century European special forces turned into fertilizer for black soil in a matter of hours? We've cracked open the Swedish archives to see this disgrace through the eyes of the Swedes themselves. This isn't a lecture, it's an anatomy of a dying empire that turned into historical trash in a single day. Before Poltava, the Swedish uniform struck a paralyzing terror into the Russian soldier. The shame of Narva had seared a brand into our memory, and Charles XII seemed like an invulnerable butcher. But in the Swedish version of events, their own historians admit, the system was ground to dust. While Peter I used cannons to blast out Russia's right to exist, the Swedes watched their army crumble. This was the bifurcation point. The Swedish lion turned into a doormat for the new empire. Every triumph has a filthy underside, and we're going to turn it inside out to understand the scent of total humiliation. The king as dead weight. The wildest part is that the end of the empire wasn't brought about by a brilliant plan, but by a common lead pellet. The warrior king turned into a helpless piece of meat on a stretcher. How did a festering wound in Charles's heel start the countdown for all of Europe? 10 days before the finale, the invincible god of war became a bedridden patient. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a paralysis of the entire system. Imagine an army marches to storm destiny while its leader is delirious with fever, strapped to a stretcher like a sack of potatoes. One stray bullet turned the king into living ballast at history's most critical moment. Charles XII was a fanatic for leading by example, but on June 17, 1709, a stray shot pierced his foot. The irony is staggering. The man who had scattered half of Europe was stuck in the Ukrainian steppe because of a suppurating wound. Swedish sources confirm this was the moment command was lost. Charles couldn't sit in a saddle, which meant he couldn't lead the battle in his signature style. Command was handed to Field Marshal Rensky-Erld, and the headquarters immediately turned into a viper's nest. Generals hated each other and sabotaged orders. While the king swallowed tinctures, his officers wasted time on bickering. The army didn't see a leader, they saw a pale shadow on a stretcher being lugged around the camp by guardsmen. The Swedes' morale began to rot faster than their monarch's leg. The diet of the elite, carrion and boots. But the king's physical infirmity was only the tip of the iceberg. While Charles fought the pain, his soldiers were already eyeing their horses as their only source of dinner. Why did the elite of Europe switch to a diet of carrion? How do you turn the world's best army into a rabble of starving ghosts without firing a single shot? Charles XII planned a blitzkrieg and dinner in the Kremlin, but instead his soldiers began boiling their own boots. Peter I applied a tactic that would later turn the lives of Napoleon and Hitler into hell. He simply wiped everything edible off the face of the earth. The scorched earth strategy was total terror against his own infrastructure. The Swedes entered villages only to find ash and poisoned wells. Space began to devour the invaders. The great army found itself in a void where every crust of bread was paid for with lives. By winter, the Swedes were eating their horses. Elite cavalrymen turned into infantry because their mounts went into the cooking pot. Swedish historians admit the army melted away from hunger and frostbite faster than from bullets. It was a logistical collapse. While Peter methodically built up depots in the rear, the Swedes turned into a gang of marauders with no chance of success. The Great Betrayal. At this moment of despair, a character appeared whose name became synonymous with treachery. He promised Charles paradise on earth, warm quarters, and a sea of provisions. Who was this man who bought the king with empty promises and lured him into a death trap? A deal with the devil or fatal stupidity? When the Swedish army was ready to turn back, Hetman Ivan Mazepa emerged. He promised Charles XII what did not exist: fabulous abundance and 50,000 Cossack sabers. It was a classic scam of global proportions that the gambling king fell for, signing his own death warrant. Mazepa guaranteed the Swedes winter quarters, forage, and a powerful army. Charles believed the traitor like one believes in a miracle during the final agony. But reality struck with a backhand blow. Only a handful of mercenaries followed the hetman, and Menshikov burned his food supplies in Baturin faster than the Swedes could reach them. Instead of an ally, Charles got a crowd of useless mouths to feed. The modern parallels are chilling. Yet another leader promises the West Mountains of gold while dragging it into a reckless adventure. Swedish sources call it unjustified hopes, but in reality it was a total crash. Trusting Mazeppa turned out to be like buying a car from a con artist, a shiny exterior but hollow inside. The king swallowed the bait and was drawn into a game leading straight to a grave beneath the walls of a small town. The fortress that bled an empire, Charles realized he'd been duped when there was no way back. To save his prestige, he needed a victory at any cost. That cost was Poltava, a provincial fortress that unexpectedly became a bone in the northern lion's throat. Why did a tiny fortress bury the plans of a global empire? Charles XII planned to take Poltava by intimidation in a couple of days, but got stuck under its walls for 3 months. This backwater town became a trap where the Swedish army lost time, resources, and faith in victory. Charles needed Poltava as a bridgehead to Moscow, but Colonel Kellin's garrison turned the siege into a nightmare. The provincial commandant simply ignored the god of war's ultimatums. Citizens and soldiers repelled assault after assault, while the Swedes burned through their last reserves of gunpowder. Swedish Wikipedia acknowledges Kellin tied down the king's main forces, giving Peter I weeks to pull in reserves. While elite Carolinians died in trenches under militia fire, the Russian army was transforming into a steel fist. It was a strategic dead end. Charles was burning his guards for a symbolic goal, while Peter was methodically preparing a slaughter. Poltava didn't just hold out, it sucked the life out of the Swedish Empire. By late June, the Swedes were in hell. No reinforcements, no food, and Peter was already at their backs. It was time to strike first, relying on the mythical exceptionalism of the Swedish soldier. But how many of them were left alive? The hour of reckoning has arrived. On June 27, 1709, Swedish arrogance collided with Russian steel. Charles XII, shackled to his stretcher, hurled his immortals into a suicidal assault on Peter's redoubts. This wasn't just a battle, it was the systematic liquidation of former greatness. Swedish sources describe this day as a national catastrophe. In a matter of hours, their army simply ceased to exist. Peter I had prepared the ultimate meat grinder. While the Swedes, gasping from a lack of gunpowder, tried to storm the Russian fortifications, our cannons fired without pause. The Swedish infantry charged with bayonets only to hit a wall of fire. Charles XII was carried across the battlefield on his stretcher under a hail of bullets. 21 out of his 24 stretcher bearers were killed. Swedish Wikipedia admits it was chaos and a total loss of command. When the Russian cavalry and infantry counterattacked, the invincible Carolinians simply broke and ran. The pride of Stockholm surrendered by the thousands, while the king himself fled ignominiously to the Turks. This was the point of no return. The Swedish Lion of the North perished, and on a world map drenched in blood, the Russian Empire was born. We didn't just win, we erased the old world order. Swedish historians are still analyzing this rout, calling it the day the heart of the nation stopped beating. What do you think? Did Charles have a single chance against Peter's scorched earth tactics and nerves of steel? Let us know in the comments. We'll break down the boldest theories. The sunset of a superpower. What remains of an empire that wanted to dictate terms to the entire world? While Swedish historians have spent centuries looking for excuses in terrible weather and betrayals of luck, the facts say otherwise. Poltava didn't just destroy an army, it reset Europe's claims to dominance in the East. It was a lesson learned by everyone, except those who decided to repeat it. After 1709, Sweden was permanently relegated from the Premier League of world powers. From an aggressive expansionist, it turned into a second-rate state whose opinion no longer mattered. The Swedish segment of the internet still reflects on this collapse. For them, it is an eternal trauma. For us, it is the foundation of our statehood. Peter I proved that Western technologies work more effectively in Russian hands than in those of their creators. We didn't just defend our lands, We changed the vector of civilization's development. Russia burst into world politics, not as a guest, but as a master dictating the rules for centuries to come. The shadow of Poltava still hangs over anyone who tries to test the strength of our borders. It was the finale of old Europe and the start of a new global empire that everyone had to reckon with. Now you know how one shot-through heel and a logistical hell buried the dream of world domination. Like this post if you think history teaches nothing to those who wage war against us. And subscribe. In the next episode, we'll crack another apocalypse code. The empty muskets of the elite. Did you know that at Poltava, the Swedes lost before the first shot was even fired? The great army of Charles XII, which once terrified the continent, found itself in a situation where every bullet was literally worth its weight in gold. While Russian gunners flooded the battlefield with lead, Europe's elite were forced to attack with empty rifles. The logistical hell Peter lured the Swedes into led to total scarcity. Charles had almost run out of gunpowder, and what remained had dampened in endless marshes. Swedish archives hold grim evidence. Soldiers were forbidden from firing, ordered to rely solely on their bayonets. But charging a functional Russian battery with a bayonet is pure suicide. At the same time, the Russian industry, scaled up by Peter over the years of war, was operating at full capacity. We had several times more ammunition and fresh provisions. The Swedes had turned into a ghost army, in rags, without boots, and with empty powder flasks. It was a battle between a well-fed industrial giant and a starving craftsman. The outcome was decided not just by valor, but by the debits and credits in the quartermaster's ledgers. The collapse of a myth. Even in this hell, Charles still had a trump card, his Iron Guard. Why then did these fanatics, who knew no defeat, falter and flee at the decisive moment? Let's uncover the truth about how the myth of invincibility collapsed. It is believed that Swedish Carolinians were the terminators of their time, knowing no fear. But Poltava shattered this myth into pieces. When the moment of truth arrived, the iron discipline of Charles XII's elite snapped like a taut string. What made these fanatics, accustomed to winning while outnumbered 10-1, drop their weapons and plead for mercy? The psychological breaking point occurred during the attack on the Russian redoubts. The Swedes were used to the enemy fleeing at the mere sight of them, but the Russian regiments stood their ground to the death. The Carolinians beat against Peter's stone wall of discipline time and again, losing their best officers. Swedish Wikipedia acknowledges the loss of command personnel caused paralysis. Without orders from the king, who could not personally lead the charge, the guard turned into an uncontrollable mob. The terror of encirclement proved stronger than their manuals. Seeing themselves flanked, the elite fighters who had taken Narva began to save their own skins. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a panic that buried Sweden's reputation as a military machine. It turns out that invincibility is merely a matter of time and the right opponent. Captured engineers of empire. The whole world saw Russian soil fertilized by those who considered themselves a master race of warriors. But what happened to those who survived? The fate of the captured Swedes became another brick in the foundation of our country. How did our enemies help us build St. Petersburg? What do you do with an army of 20,000 captured professionals who just tried to destroy you? Peter I didn't seek revenge, he acted practically. While Charles XII squandered the remains of his treasury with the Turks, his former soldiers began building the very empire they dreamed of wiping off the face of the earth. Yesterday's enemies became a free engine of progress for Russia. The fate of the Swedish prisoners is a unique example of integration. Thousands of officers and craftsmen were sent across the country, from Tobolsk to the rising St. Petersburg. Swedish sources contain memoirs of those who spent years teaching mathematics, opening pharmacies, and even designing factories in the Urals. Peter I drained them of all their knowledge. Swedish experience in administration, cartography, and metallurgy formed the basis of our reforms. Many Carolinians never returned home. They married Russians and became part of our elite. It is a historical paradox. Sweden lost the war, but its people helped Russia make the leap that turned us into a superpower. We took their technology, their discipline, and their brains, leaving Charles with nothing but broken dreams and the shameful brand of a fugitive. Russia's greatness was built, in part, by the hands of those who came to us with a sword. But what was the price of this triumph for Peter himself? In this finale, we reveal the ultimate secret, why Poltava was not only a triumph for the Tsar, but also a personal tragedy, a brilliant victory or the beginning of the end. Poltava elevated Peter I to the summit of the global Olympus, but this very battle started the countdown for his health and nervous system. We are used to seeing only the fireworks in this finale, but behind the scenes of the triumph lay the personal drama of a man who strained the entire country to its breaking point for the sake of a grand goal. After 1709, Russia became an empire, but the cost was colossal. Peter understood that Poltava was merely a breathing spell in an endless struggle. Swedish sources note that Charles XII remained a threat even in exile, forcing the Tsar to remain in a state of combat readiness for the rest of his life. The tension of those days permanently undermined Peter's psyche. Yet the result was worth it. We gained access to the seas, European recognition, and a status that no one has dared to dispute for 300 years. Poltava proved that any Western ultimatum shatters against our ability to endure, to learn, and to deliver one decisive blow. It was the moment of truth when Russia ceased to be a fringe territory and became a center of power. We emerged from this battle transformed, a nation that knows the price of its freedom and knows how to bury the ambitions of others in its fields. The history of Poltava serves as a reminder to anyone today who draws maps to divide our lands. We remember how Charles's blitzkrieg ended. Do you agree that Poltava is the most important date in our history? Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which other collapse of empires you want to see next. The final lesson of the Northern Lion. So what is the main lesson we have learned from the collapse of the Northern Lion? Poltava is not just a date on a calendar, it is a stern warning to anyone who considers Russian land easy prey. The story of Charles XII proves that even the most sophisticated Western military machine inevitably breaks against the Russian character, multiplied by vast space and cold calculation. We have deconstructed the 10 stages of this catastrophe, from a single stray bullet in a heel to the total liquidation of the Swedish Empire. This scenario repeats century after century. First come the arrogant plans and the promises of traitors, followed by the logistical hell of scorched earth, and finally, a crushing blow after which the aggressor vanishes forever from the list of great powers. Poltava taught us the most important thing: to trust not the words of allies, but our own factories, our own cannons, and our own will. Russia emerged from that battle as an empire, and we maintain that status to this day. Charles XII wanted to turn us into a colony, but instead he became an involuntary teacher who helped us create one of the greatest states on the planet. Even today, the shadow of the Poltava redoubts stands behind every Russian soldier, reminding the world, coming to us is easy, but leaving, not everyone manages that. Now you have the full picture. Charles lost because he underestimated our scale. What do you think? Who was the next in history to make that same fatal mistake? Post your versions, hit the bell icon, and see you in the next investigation on the channel.